Britain's former Prime Minister Tony Blair, now a Middle East peace mediator, has been attending the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. We spoke to him about the Geneva II conference on Syria. The international peace talks are aimed at ending the Syrian civil war.
Geneva II talks are low. Do you expect any results at all to come out of this week?
Obviously the situation is incredibly difficult on the ground, and the likelihood is, unless President Assad feels under real pressure to come to an agreement on the ground, then the likelihood of a solution is let's say it's going to be difficult.
How do you think the international community can help bring together two sides that are so bitterly opposed?
Over these past 6 to 9 months, I think the situation on the ground has shifted back towards the regime. They're obviously getting a huge amount of help from Iran, from Hezbollah, who are really fighting on the ground and have given them that ground force capability they lacked a couple of years ago. And therefore, I think for us in the West, what we've got to ask ourselves is, how do we put the opposition in a position where they're going to be bargaining on equal terms? Now, the complicating factor, of course, is the opposition has also got elements within it that we feel deeply unhappy about. Al-Qaeda linked groups, jihadist fighters and so on. And so this is why the situation has now become very, very complex. But we should never forget there's probably a majority of people in Syria who want a sensible solution to this, who realize that the different religious groupings have got to live in peace together. But at the moment they're not, they don't have the strength to make their voice count.
Do you think that the UK and other Western powers should be looking into arming the rebels? And would it even be possible when the groups are so disparate?
I think the first question for us is, are we prepared in any way at all to intervene in order to alter the balance of power on the ground? And I think we should be prepared to do that. I mean, as I say, I've argued for 2 years we should at least be trying to create a no-fly zone for not just to give some respite to the civilian population, but to send a signal to the regime: you are not going to keep the country under your control by pulverizing the civilian population.
We hear now of more than 100,000 deaths, massive refugee crisis. Do you think the international community bears some responsibility for not stepping in so far?
I know from my time as Prime Minister how difficult these decisions are. You intervene, you get one group of problems. We've seen that in Afghanistan and in Iraq. On the other hand, you don't intervene, the situation doesn't sort itself out. And the problem is, all the time when you've got this combination of dictatorship that is prepared to use extraordinary and horrific force against the civilian population on the one side, and extremist groups sponsored either by Iran on the Shia side or groups like al-Qaeda on the Sunni side, when you have that situation, it's going to be very, very hard and tough to take the decisions necessary in order to shape that situation. And there is a reluctance in the West to do that. I understand the reasons for that, but the fact is, as we can see today, the consequences of non-intervention are also very serious.
Why do you think there's been this reticence in the West?
It's as simple as this. It's tough. You go into a situation where, a group like Hezbollah, they're prepared to lose scores of fighters in a day and go straight back in again and fight. So when you're up against people, and likewise, the reason why these opposition elements in the jihadist opposition elements in Syria have started to get traction on the ground is they're prepared to go and kill and die. So that makes them a tough enemy to defeat. My only plea is, if you look across what's happening in the region right now, I think there is basically one fight going on, and that's between those people who believe in a future for the region that is open-minded, tolerant, with economies that are modern, societies that are modern, and those people who want various forms of extremism based on, frankly, a wrong-headed view of religion. So that's the fight, and what I think is important for us in the West is that we're on the side of the decent people who are probably majority, but they're not organized, and they're not the ones prepared to go and kill.
What do you think the fallout will be across the region if Syria continues to disintegrate?
I think it'll be disastrous, and I don't think it'll stop at the region. So that's why I think it's such a serious situation. It's not just countries You can see what's happening in Iraq again now, Lebanon, obviously countries like Jordan who are standing up to the pressure very well, but they come under enormous pressure too. But I think outside of the region, I mean, look, we've got hundreds of UK citizens who've gone and been fighting in Syria. I mean, they're UK citizens, they're going to come back. So we've got a large Muslim population in Europe. So I think, you know, this is, well, it's very difficult and challenging, and I understand why the leadership today finds it tough and challenging.
I'd just like to finally touch on Iran and the UN's taking back of their invitation to Tehran to attend the Geneva 2 talks. President Hassan Rouhani spoke to Euronews yesterday, and he said to us that the UN's authority has been undermined by the way it's handled this. Do you agree with that?
You know, these are always very tricky diplomatic situations, because the UN Secretary General obviously thought Iran was coming on one basis. They, for whatever reason, thought they were coming on another basis, and that other basis was unacceptable to the Syrian opposition. So I understand how the thing came about. I don't frankly think the issue right now is whether Iran's invited or not invited. The issue is, as I said, how do we alter the balance of power on the ground so that President Assad knows he's got to come to an agreement about a transition.
So you think a diplomatic solution can be found without engagement from Iran?
Well, I think, look, Iran's engaged. So whether you do that, I mean, the reality is, it's easier to say this when you're out of office than in office, but the reality is Iran is engaged in that situation. And if there's going to be a solution, they need to get the right signals as well, and they will be receiving those signals. But what the Syrian government and the Assad government and the Iranian government will be looking at the moment is they'll be looking to see the degree of will there is on our side to make sure that this works, and that's what will be important.
Would you, on a personal level, like to have a greater role in the diplomatic efforts to help the Syrian people?
No, I think I'll leave that to the negotiators that are there right now. I mean, look, I find what's happening in Syria deeply distressing. And I think across the region, there are huge issues upon which Western interests are dramatically and profoundly engaged. But the guys who are negotiating that now, and Mr. Brahimi, by the way, who's leading this Syrian negotiation, a very, very experienced man, long experience and very skillful.
We had a very spirited discussion on the subject of the overflights. And I made it very clear that for those of us who are engaged in an effort to see President Assad step down and to see a democratic process take hold with a transitional government according to the Geneva communique, for those of us engaged in that effort, anything that supports President Assad is problematic. And I made it very clear to the Prime Minister that the overflights from Iran are in fact helping to sustain President Assad and his regime. We agreed to try to provide more information with respect to this, but I also made it clear to him that there are members of Congress and people in America who increasingly are watching what Iraq is doing and wondering how it is that a partner in the efforts for democracy and a partner for whom Americans feel they have tried so hard to be helpful, how that country can be in fact doing something that makes it more difficult to achieve our common goals.
Supporting the rebels is one thing, though, but putting spokes in Assad's wheels is another. America has been demanding Iraq search Syria-bound planes for weapons, going so far as to call on it to ground all passing jets. But to Washington's dismay, Baghdad hasn't been all that enthusiastic. RT's Marina Portnaya reports.
As the Syrian government struggles to stay in power, fighting against rebels backed by the West, America is also attempting to suffocate the alleged weapons flying into Damascus. Washington accuses Iran of being the key arms supplier to Assad forces. And to stop the transfer, the U.S. is now reportedly demanding that Baghdad inspect planes flying from Iran over its airspace into Syria.
The American government, unfortunately, has had very strong rule over Iraq and many other countries. This is just one more example. The amazing thing is that the American government is saying that they can control flights over countries and force airplanes to land.
By doing so, the U.S. has created something of a paradox, forcing Iraq to prevent Iran from dealing with Syria.
By bringing up this issue of so-called weapons supplies, it's just another way to pressure the Baghdad regime. The United States feels that since it invested blood and treasure in terms of overthrowing Saddam Hussein, that it has the right, if not the obligation, to then order the internal affairs of the Baghdad regime. Obviously, al-Maliki objects to this kind of approach, and I dare say that the Iraqi people object to that approach as well.
Unnamed U.S. officials have complained that Baghdad is not doing enough to cooperate with Washington's demands. Since September, Iraq has only managed to allegedly inspect 2 Iranian planes. Baghdad does not have an air force, and grounding planes is proving too costly, as they must be refueled after each check. Recently, Iraq made it clear that it is not willing to march to the beat of America's drum. In an interview with the New York Times, Iraq's Minister of Transportation said, quote, "We are an independent country and our stance is clear. We will search whichever plane we want, whenever we want. We will not take orders."
With Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and telling him to stop letting Iran fly aircraft full of weapons over Iraq and into Syria. Secretary Kerry is reportedly going to tell him that if these flights, which apparently take off every single day, are not going to stop altogether, then each one should at the very least be inspected.
Correspondent Leland Vittert has the evidence.
For over a month now, soldiers have been filing off civilian cargo planes at Syrian military airports, appearing ready for battle. Western intelligence sources tell Fox News the men are Iranian Revolutionary Guard troops coming to help President Bashar al-Assad in Syria's long civil war. Iran has exploited the recent lack of media attention on Syria to significantly ramp up its flights, often sending tons of ammunition, weapons, and equipment multiple times a week. Once again, the planes are flying via Iraqi airspace. After a previous Fox report on the resupply flights, the U.S. put pressure on Iraq and the flights stopped. Now they are in the air again. Iraq says it's inspecting the planes for military hardware, but sources say the inspection is done on the return flight when the plane is empty to appease the U.S., yet keep the flights going. It couldn't come at a more important time. 18 months into the civil war, defections from the Syrian army mean that President Assad has less well-trained men. Recent rebel takeovers of Syrian army warehouses have robbed Assad soldiers of equipment, and the army is running low on ammunition. While diplomatic pressure from the United States is the only thing that can stop Iran's arms shipments via Iraqi airspace, here in Israel they take a more proactive approach. Last month, the Jewish state reportedly bombed an Iranian-owned weapons facility in Sudan. Sources say it was used by Iran to store rockets before shipping them north to Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza. Brett.
Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif met his Turkish counterpart in Istanbul Saturday to discuss Syria and Iraq. The two leaders sat down amid tensions in the region. At a news conference, Zarif said they found common cause when it comes to Syria.
Both countries strive for the well-being of the Syrian people. All countries should help the people of Syria so they can come to a compromise and reach a solution that is acceptable for all the fragments of society, and this can only be obtained with elections. The public should make their decision with general elections.
He also said he hoped an election will help restore peace in Iraq, which has seen a recent upsurge in violence.
When it comes to Iraq, we hope that they will hold elections successfully and they will manage to establish a government that would ensure peace as an outcome.
Iraqi troops have reportedly lost control of key parts of Anbar province after intense fighting with al-Qaeda-linked militants and local Sunni tribesmen.